Welcome to Talking Impact, your go-to podcast for exploring the powerful connection between mental health, education, and resilient youth. Join us as we uncover insights and stories that inspire classrooms, stronger minds, brighter futures, and a lasting impact in our society. Welcome to another episode of Talking Impact. New set. We're on video now, which is awesome. Thanks to Owen, who we're going to get to know a bit today. We're joined with Jordan Rempel, who's our program director at Impact Society, occasional co-host of Talking Impact, and all-around partner in doing well in this world. Excited to have you here today, Owen. Owen is the CEO of Indelible Studios, which is where we're filming from today, actually. Owen's business is dedicated to helping Alberta businesses to tell their stories, to take their brand and to bring it into the story realm. Very applicable to what we do as an organization, but also why we do what we do, to equip youth with the ability to chart their own story, to be able to redeem some of the difficulties of their tales, and to use story really as a way to grow those life skills and those mental health strengths and resilience for the long haul. Before we dive into the power of story and the power of meaning making when it comes to developing young people and supporting youth, you tell us a little bit about your story and what you do. You're a successful marketing leader, and you've had a lot of experience over the last 15, 20 years. Maybe dive into who you are, what you do, and why you do it.
Yeah, sure. First of all, thanks for having me. I'm excited to chat with you guys today. I think I've been in marketing for 10 or 15 years. I've tried a lot of different things across the discipline of marketing. It's fairly broad. And it got to a point, I think, maybe 2 or 3 years ago where I was really trying to identify where my strengths were versus, inside of that ecosystem, inside of my team that I had and the business that we had, and even for the clients that we had, the mix of people we were working with. And I spent a lot of time just distilling it down to sort of what it is that I bring to the table from like a communication standpoint. I really look at it as, at the end of the day, like after a lot of journaling, a lot of working on it, a lot of false starts and, different sort of like concepts or pitches or whatever it might be. At the end of the day, I'm a storyteller. I see and think and speak in story, and I try to bring that gift to the table for the businesses that I work with. The simplest way I think I could put it is that we all as humans have story-shaped holes in our brain. It's actually how we receive information. We don't receive facts. We receive facts in context, with characters, with personality, and all that other stuff. And so in the simplest form, what I try to do is help people punch through their facts and lay them against a scaffolding of stories so that somebody could actually receive it, fit it in their brain, hold it as a memory, retell it to somebody else, those kinds of things. And so a lot of the origin for what we work on with people comes out of some of the oldest stories that are told in society, like studying Aesop's fables, studying Grimm's fairy tales, Grimm's book of fairy tales and stuff like that, and even some other older literature and stuff like that. What were the structures of story that made them last for a long time? What were the methods that people used to tell stories that would allow them to be retold around a campfire? So we sort of shamelessly rip off some of the oldest forms of stories possible in order to apply them in a modern context to help people's businesses land with their customer and their audience.
So before we go forward, go back a bit. I'm really curious. We talk about storytelling all the time. It's a key to what we do. It's a key to who we are. As you said, we all have story-shaped holes in our brains. I love that. What is a story? Like, to get really fundamental with it in simple terms, like what do you mean when you come to this realization that we need to be able to tell better stories? We need to go back to some of those old stories that resonated with humanity for thousands of years, some of these stories. What is it? What is the recipe, if you know it?
I would say, like, I'm sure there's people way smarter than me that have more concise definitions, but what I would say is the story is the connective tissue between events. So an event on its own is neither good nor bad Like absent of any other context, it's just an event. Just like a fact is a fact, and absent of any other context, it has very little relevance usually. It's the story is the things that connect facts together for some form of outcome, insight, or enlightenment in someone's life, in someone's business, in someone's journey, whatever it might be.
Very cool, very cool.
Yeah, and it's awesome. Like just meeting you for the first time today, getting to come into the studio. You know, I've had the opportunity to do a bit of filming with Impact Society, but today was different because it was really focused on just having a conversation. You know, it didn't feel as intense. It didn't feel like all these lights were on you, like you needed to get it right. It really felt like, hey, here's a person that wants to hear my story and our story. And I really appreciate just how much effort you put into making your guests feel like they have a platform, like they have, and making them feel comfortable. And something that I'm really interested in, you know, you've kind of walked us through the storytelling and how important the story is just hearing a bit more of your story. You know, we've got to hear Owen the businessman, Owen the success, and what did it take to get there? What were some of the challenges that you faced to get to where you are today?
Yeah, I mean, life is a challenge. It's all challenges, I think, in a way. So I there's certainly some like turning points and things that have kind of shone a light or like illuminated an area of my life or illuminated some sort of an insight that's helped me or helped to shape who I am, I would say. You know, if I go back to thinking about like being the kid that loved being funny in class. I was the class clown, not necessarily the popular class clown, but just the one with a quip, the one with a comment. I had a tough time keeping my mouth in and my words under control, I would say, growing up, and found that I could get myself into trouble with the words that I was saying, and also shortly following that, found that I could get myself out of trouble with the things I would say or the stories that I would tell and that kind of thing. And so I think I've always sort of used my words as a way of navigating. I found, you know, as I came into more sort of a mature young adult, I found that I had an ability to relate to most people that I met. Like I'd never had a trouble getting into a relationship with somebody and finding common ground with people. And I think, you know, I used, I never would have thought about that as a story thing. I never would have looked at that as a narrative thing or anything like that. But I think as, you know, hindsight is 20/20, you get a chance to look back. And I think what I realize is that even in areas where I'm not, like, I don't share a passion with someone, I can share the experience of a passion because I see the way that someone perceives something is just the same way that I would perceive something that I'm passionate about. So I can kind of connect dots with people. I think it's maybe a way of looking at it. I don't know if that was what your question was.
Yeah, no, totally. And I love that how you kind of brought it in there too, because, you know, talking about being the class clown, I assume it got you in a little bit of trouble and in some hot water once in a while. And something that we talk about so often in Heroes is often those things that you struggle with or that can maybe get you in trouble or land you in some hot water are your strengths in disguise, right? And it's like you had you had like a strength that you just didn't know it was a strength, right? And like now over some years and probably a little bit of pain and hardships, you've created a business where it's like, hey, I'm using my strength to focus on other people's strengths and get the best out of their story as well.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? I've never connected that dot before, but that's such a good way to think about it. Like you're growing up and your strengths are emerging, they're becoming more visible, but they're not tuned, they're not directed necessarily. They're not attached to some higher purpose that drives them or commands them. And even as a young person, like you're still working on your discipline, the discipline of your will, like how much what you want versus what actions you take and those kinds of things. So, but yeah, it's a good way of looking at it. And I think there is generally, as I observe other people, I see when they are in their strengths, it can be inspiring to see, but when they apply their strengths to help someone else, it can be absolutely like world changing.
Totally.
When someone takes their gift and makes it a gift for someone else, as opposed to just a gift that they exercise for themselves, that sort of thing. So it is a journey of getting there, because I think, even in my early career as a marketer, a lot of my gifts were spent in sort of the sales area, which is very much like using a gift of storytelling for the purpose of for your own purposes. I think this business here in this studio really is a chance to say, like, I want to just make an environment that makes it easier for somebody else to tell their story, makes it easier for me to coach someone to tell their story better, or to help them to pull the truth out and pull the connective tissue out in a way that it's relevant to someone else, that kind of thing.
I think we see that a lot in historical stories, actually. The gifts were there, but it required a going out and a challenge and some support of the hero's journey. That call to action. You have something, but you need to leave your status quo, comfortable malaise and go out and do something with it, which may require you to go down into the depths. And I think those are two critical pieces. Is one, that the hero had potential and needed to go through that journey to reach their full potential. But then also that crisis that comes, and in life they will come. That hero has been preparing those strengths for that perfect time, to be able to take them from maybe more background strengths that were hidden or being used in the wrong ways to now really be focused in, because now life and crisis has come and really helped you to hone those in. If you could go back and think about your whether it was junior high or senior high, 11 to 18, in that critical period of life where we're forming our own self-concept and our own self-story, was there a crisis? Was there an enemy? Was there that dark night of the soul where you learned more about your strengths and were able to then become a better or renewed person?
The one that comes to mind, I was trying to think on this before we chatted a bit, so that I had an example queued up, but junior high sucked. Like, I think that we don't probably give kids or young people enough credit. Like, that's a hard period of life generally, and then we cram a bunch of people going through puberty into four walls and make them get along, and with like as much supervision as we can afford, whatever, administratively. Like, it's a tough period, and I think it's there was a turning point in my life where I felt junior high was tough for me, and then the turning point was realizing that junior high was just tough for everybody. And I remember it as I had gone to elementary school, got pulled out of that elementary school, went to a new one for being too much of a class clown, and kind of had a chance to reset. This is like it's very funny to think about, like, a grade 3 kid being expelled, but it wasn't quite that harsh, but it was kind of like, you need to find a new school for your son. So we did. I had a group of friends there that were like my group of friends growing up, from like, ECS or whatever it was to like grade 3. And then from grade 4 till 6, I was in a different school, but the two schools combined in junior high. So I got to junior high, and there was, even in my heart, there was some anticipation, being like, oh, I get to connect with those people that I haven't seen in 3 years, that I haven't, like, we had great relationships. And I got to junior high and we weren't friends. Like, we just ended up on different sides of the social fence. And I was not a popular kid necessarily. I had plenty of good friends, but I was on the other side of that divide, so to speak. And one of the guys who was my there's sort of 3 of us in like grade 2 and 3, where we were thick as thieves. We were always together and like did birthday parties together and all that stuff. For one reason or another, just we didn't vibe. We didn't vibe together in junior high. And I remember he beat me up in the gym locker room, not the locker room, but it was like a storage room or something like that. Like, all the kids go in there unsupervised to get their badminton rackets or something like that, and he just kind of like pounded the crap out of me for a couple minutes. And it was a humiliating experience. It was like a very downward experience and that kind of thing. And it we got out of it. You move on, you get out of it. It wasn't like it wasn't damaged or anything like that. It just kind of sucked, and it was embarrassing and that kind of thing. It was a year later. That was like a long run up, but so it was like a past relationship gone bad, not sure why. I'm still a kid trying to navigate that stuff, and feeling like junior high is hard for me. And I can remember this vividly in my mind. Coming to school one day, it was the next year, I think, and it was I walked through the doors of the school, and as soon as I opened the door, I could just tell that something was wrong. You could feel that it was wrong. I wasn't able to put my finger on it, but as I'm walking to my locker, I'm seeing this person's crying. I'm not sure why they are. These people are kind of huddled around and they're whispering. Everybody's got this kind of pallor on them. And I had found out that that young man had committed suicide the day before. And it was devastating. He wasn't my friend any longer, but he was a human being that I knew. And this was a kid that had beat me up, months earlier, and like been on the other side of conflict from me. And here I am finding that like he's made this decision, and it's a heavy thing for a kid to walk through. But and for the whole school to walk through, it was devastating for his parents and everything. And I've never forgotten it. I've never forgotten him. I don't think I ever will. That's like an indelible impression. That's kind of the definition of indelible to me, is like something you're never going to forget. The thing that it illuminated for me was junior high school is hard for everybody. Not just junior high school, but life in general is hard for everybody. And so when it taught me, like, it kind of in a harsh light taught me empathy, I would say. Not necessarily functional empathy, but at least the ability to detach from the story that I am living in, and to be able to perceive that other people too are living in their own stories. And that, I would say, fundamentally adjusted the course of my life. Like, not at that time, it wasn't like I knew and made up my mind, I'm going to be this now, I'm going to be different, this is going to change or whatever. It just was like, I didn't realize that until that moment. I didn't have that ability to see that somebody else has got a story that they're telling themselves as they walk through the halls, just as I am. And you can be in complete opposition from someone in some way, but can be walking a completely parallel path with them and not even actually know it.
Right. And that's our basic status as humans. We go about our own story. We talked earlier about main character syndrome, which is quite prevalent these days, where there isn't empathy. They may be up to good stuff, heroic stuff, but it is all about them.
Yeah.
And they're not doing what you talked about, paralleling their story and understanding that there's a connectedness to this conversation. And how do you see that playing out in terms of when you're in junior high? This is hard to remember going back then, but you're going through this process, this transformative process, which is around that age you start to really realize yourself within a different context than just mom and dad. You start to see yourself within your ecosystem, your classroom, and your teacher. How would you put like that difficulty of junior high? Do you think it is that, or is there other pieces going on? What do you think? Maybe not about this individual, that's a pretty tough story, but if you could think about your other peers or other former peers that were part of a different friend group, what do you think was the driver behind the difficulties or the experiences that were making it a lot more difficult for everyone to be able to get through that period of life?
Yeah, I think I don't want to get too like academic about it, but I probably would bring it back to power, like systems of power. I do think like there's a sort of post-enlightenment frame that we live within, whether we recognize it or not, where we define things in hierarchies of better, worse, stronger, weaker, richer, poorer. Like we've kind of removed as society an ultimate definition of good in order to replace it with a series of relative definitions of good and bad and better and worse and all those kinds of things. And I think it's a subtle change. That's a subtle thing over the course of like a couple hundred years of human thinking, like influencing society. But the challenge, I think, sometimes in those settings is you start to separate your own identity from the identity you share with your family. So you start to express more individually. is you're trying to do that at the same time that everybody else is trying to do that. And we all live inside of this sort of framework of power dynamics and those kinds of things. And so the pecking order is going to emerge, or the comparison is going to emerge. Like, comparison is the thief of joy. It sounds like a platitude. 'Cause it is a platitude, but it's a platitude because it's absolutely true. Yeah. Like you get into these scenarios where you're starting to try to figure out who you are, and you have no choice but to define that by the contrast of which you see in other people around you. And so I think in an unsupervised or and I don't just mean like somebody policing this, I just mean somebody walking through it with you. If you don't have someone walking through it with you, it's so easy to just like bounce off of all of these things that are around you and like end up in a place where like your identity is a little bit of this that I've grabbed off this person, a little bit of this I grabbed off that person, a little bit of not that because I don't like it over there or whatever it might be, rather than an identity that's defined by like, hey, you're here for a purpose, you're created on purpose, you exist in a series of relationships that love and support you, and I think that's true of everyone. So I guess to wrap it up, it's like we abandon the truth of our existence to adopt the relative definitions of self based off of something else. That's maybe a little bit.
I'd say that's pretty in line with the psychology around it, especially when you think of the superego is as a child, that's mom and dad.
Yes.
But as you enter into junior high and high school, it's everywhere.
Yeah.
This is the danger of social media, to be honest.
Totally.
At its core. Because it's bombarding you with these superego messages that say, the world expects this of you. So don't you dare let them see who you are. Mm-hmm. Be who they need you to be so that you will have acceptance and find an in-group. Mm. And that there, I think, is one of the biggest lies that we tell ourselves as humanity so often, is, I can just, I'm okay if you're okay, type of thing. Meanwhile, we're going about our lives as strangers to your story that you told. And we see it too often, Jordan, in our schools where we're being asked to come in and bring heroes in. Yeah. We see huge transformation through this process, especially when you have grade 7, grade 8, and grade 9s all doing the hero's process and all coming through the hero's journey with their own story, their own real story. But at the beginning, it's so often the status quo. Teacher doesn't know what's going on with the students. Some of the students know what's going on with the students, but there's these little fiefdoms fighting and vying for power. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, the teacher's just trying to keep some sensibility in the classroom, and the principal's doing that on a higher level, if you will. And that, unfortunately, like I said, is status quo. However, I think we can all agree, the three of us as parents, educators, and leaders are here to change that, at least challenge it. Jordan, I was just wondering around that, like when we bring heroes into the classroom, how does the conversation, how do the stories that we tell and the process that we guide them through, how does it help to get rid of that fear of being known and grow that acceptance and that desire and that curiosity to know others?
Yeah. I wanted to go back to and just, Owen, like looking at your story, I think it ties in very well to this question too, kind of having this very painful time in your life that really pointed you in the direction that you eventually needed to go with, like the stories and recognizing that everybody has a story. And I think that's what we uniquely do in Heroes. I think the majority of us can look back at we are where we are, where we're resilient because a lot of negative past experiences or something bad happening around us and figuring out how to adjust, how to build, how to get through that. And what Heroes alleviates is the need to go through that traumatic event. And that's what I really appreciated. Like, I have been through a lot of trauma in my adolescent life. I've shared it on this podcast, my stories in the book. It's easy to find. I've been through a lot of things. I've been homeless. I've been addicted. I've attempted suicide. All these things have happened. I am extremely grateful now that all those things happen because I'm a resilient person and I'm adaptable and I can handle whatever life throws at me. And I know for me, there's nothing that I want more than my kids to be resilient. But I know that I do not want them to go through 25% as much as I did to become resilient. Right. And I think that's where Heroes really steps in, because it allows students to go through the journey, to hear these stories, to hear each other's stories, to hear their educators' stories, to hear their guidance counselors, their principals, whoever's coming in and helping facilitate the program, and recognizing that the things that they're feeling, the things that are going on in their life aren't unique to them. You know, yes, you are a unique individual. Yes, the experiences that you're going through, but the feelings that you have, and those feelings of isolation or rejection or failure, all those things that you kind of alluded to in your story, those are part of the human journey, right? And if we can just simplify that and give them the tools to navigate it without having to actually go through, and I'm not saying we're going to alleviate trauma by any means, obviously, but we're giving them the tools so when they are placed in those adverse situations, they can navigate it with more certainty and less pain, right? Knowing that they have the strengths, they have the support systems, they have the educators, they have the guidance counselors, they have their parents, their peers, all these people that they've built relationships through, that they can go to and be like, hey, this is what's going on in my life. These are things that are happening. I need support. And for them to know that, like, hey, they're not alone in that, and there is people that are actually in their corner. So I think that's what Heroes really ties in. We use these stories, and we have such a diverse group of stories of people that have overcome addiction, have struggled with mental health, that moved to Canada, didn't know the language, didn't know the culture, how do I fit? We got stories of people that had great support systems, great parents, great opportunities, that dedicated their life to living out their dreams, but hey, still ran into a life storm and had to overcome it, right? So it's like everybody has a story, and what we were able to do is create some normalcy around like the hardships that we go through in life, and actually have some of those conversations without opening up a can of traumatic worms. Still having those strength-based conversations, but about harder topics, without diving in and getting into the weeds of the specific traumatic event of the youth, but just giving them the solution and really refocusing. It's like, hey, this is what we're good at. You know, these are the things that you're good at, and these are the ways that you can apply them to move forward.
Some of what I hear there is like we use stories with more extreme settings, more extreme reversals or outcomes, whatever it might be, because, and I think in your words is like, so that we can avoid some of those extreme trauma. Like you don't have to walk through trauma to learn this lesson. You can read the story, understand the story, and hopefully get the same lesson without going through the trauma and that kind of thing. I think that is story. Like I think Aesop's fables are some of the oldest stories recorded and passed down, and there's very, 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 very simple. He used animals as characters to sort of fast forward through character development. Like everybody thinks a fox is wily because they see a fox, how it moves around, and it's just enough for us to get it. Or if I say the tortoise and the hare, you already know that the moral of the story, like you can say tortoise and the hare, and everybody in their head goes, slow and steady wins a race. Like, and it's an automatic thing because it's been taught to us since we were 2 years old, or read to us at 1 year old, or whatever it might be. Story always uses extremes to be able to allow our brain to connect those dots. And the simplest stories have to be even more extreme. Oh, this girl gets locked in a tower for years, and then she's finally rescued after somebody battles their way through it, but her Prince Charming finds her and gets her out of it. That's an extreme story, but it's actually also extremely relatable because it's not that different from the setting of just maturing as a young woman, growing as a young woman, or even parents letting their young child grow and become their own person, that kind of thing. The morals of these stories rely on extremes to be able to stick the message, and so I think that those kinds of things, test someone's testimony, somebody's story that they tell about what they've been through. It's a hugely important piece of the puzzle for young people to be able to avoid pitfalls and mistakes and those kinds of things.
Makes me think. I grew up born in the 80s, so I grew up in the just say no generation, and there were stories. You'd have the old copper or the former addict coming into the assembly, and they tell you their cautionary tale.
Right.
They didn't seem to stick, and part of the reason we use stories of real people who've had extreme, to your point, difficulties is not to give them cautionary tales, but to give them redemptive tales. Tales where people who were at the brink, contemplating suicide, attempting suicide,
Right.
using drugs hoping they'd die, trapped in a vicious cycle of abuse or gang violence, right? Like these are, or just broke both of my legs 2 weeks before training camp in the NHL. Like these things are real, they're extreme. However, I do feel, and I want to get your perspective on this, the failure of purely cautionary tales as an instrument to help youth or any person develop their own story and connect to that story.
Yeah, like what does it take for them to be able to connect to it? Or
And where do you see the difference between a cautionary tale and a redemptive story from a marketing or from an education lens?
So, see what you do with this. These are thoughts that I think about but don't often bring to words. So
on the show.
I think like a good story creates cognitive dissonance. It brings us to a place in our mind. Cognitive dissonance is that icky feeling of what? I don't, excuse me, like
My
that
reality does not.
it doesn't quite match up to
ideas.
my expectations, and my experience are not aligned right now. And so I expect the story to go one way, and the experience that I'm being moved through is going in a different way. And as that gap widens, our cognitive dissonance grows. A good story intentionally opens our cognitive dissonance, intentionally creates dissonance in us, but then even more intentionally weaves it back together into an integrative resolution, something that says, I'm going to grab a piece of this lesson, I'm going to grab a piece of this lesson, I'm going to bring this in, I'm going to tie it together, and you're going to understand that it's not what you thought it was, but it's not entirely different. It's just slightly different. We've turned your mind somehow through inserting cognitive dissonance or triggering cognitive dissonance that might already be there. And so when I think about like cautionary tales, it's oftentimes just a story that's not finished. Sure. And a redemptive tale is often a story that at least has a chapter closed, or at least it's mostly finished. It can be told in a finished way. So when you come in and say, don't do drugs because look at me, it's not motivating. It may not even create any cognitive dissonance. I'd say sometimes you look at the person and you're like, wow, you look like someone who just did drugs before you came here. Like, God bless you. but whereas a redemptive tale where you see someone who's quite successful and they say, let me tell you about where I was. Now there's a cognitive dissonance in the character that you're telling me that you used to be versus what I'm seeing right now, what I'm seeing in front of me. That cognitive dissonance is opening. Like I wouldn't have known that you had attempted suicide. We'll have to talk about that at some point. Like I would like to hear the story of how you managed to conquer that, how you managed to move through it, because I would never have today in our conversations today so far, I would never have guessed that. It opens up a curiosity, it opens up a dissonance that then you weave together with a lesson and a moral. That's a redemptive story. That gives, if you tell it the right way, and if it's delivered in a way that can be received, because I think that there's a lot of nuance to this. This is why there's an infinite number of stories out there. But they all do these sort of have moved through these fundamental shapes to work within our brain in a way, which I believe we're designed to our brains are designed to work within that way, to come back together, I guess, at the end.
You had me thinking about the tortoise and the hare. Where's the redemption in that? It's the tortoise's story.
It's the tortoise's
His
story.
redemption is using his strengths.
Yes.
Persistence. Continuance. Commitment to win the race.
Yeah.
If it was from the hare's perspective, we'd need a chapter 2, wouldn't we?
Yes. Yeah. Like, oh man, I lost. I thought I was going to win. I had these strengths. I was ready to go. I got into a race that I was surely going to win. But I lost it by surprise. And the lesson would be arrogance. The hare is set up as an arrogant character within the first sentence of the original fable. It's implied that he's the antagonist in the story, and that his Achilles heel is his arrogance. And so the end of the tortoise and the hare is like the redemptive story for the tortoise, but it's the deepest part of struggle for the hare, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Chapter 2 to like find his mentor and like bring him out of that.
Back up.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
That's an interesting idea, actually, just like writing chapter 2s, flipping some of the characters around and writing chapter 2s to some of these like very simple stories. That's an interesting challenge.
Totally.
Maybe I'll do that.
Yeah, reminds me of Mighty Ducks for some reason. Gordon Bombay.
Yeah, totally. Man. Yeah, 100%.
Down and out, he was successful.
Yeah,
He got too cocky and had to start over, rebuild themselves, right?
Yeah, well, and his was like a story of, which is like one of the greatest movies of all time, arguably. But like, it's a good story because they tie it together. Remember, the story is the connective tissue between events. So he's under immense pressure as a kid and crumbles because of that pressure. Was not ready for it. He was the rising star. He had purpose. He was off on his mission. Crumbled under the pressure because it came too early. And then you see his life, a series of maladaptive coping mechanisms, drinking and partying and women and those kinds of things, that eventually ends in or comes to a place of collapse, and then a slow rebuilding from there. Even as it's got his mentor in it and everything like that. Like, it's all the ingredients are there.
So when I think about all this in story, I want to go back to Jordan here in terms of some of that change we see in the classroom, especially for teachers and parents, because the teacher and the parent play a very similar role. They're just in different environments and different contexts built in. But the ability of the teachers, I was in a classroom in Edmonton earlier this spring, and this teacher just told her story of her own difficulties in junior high and wanting to do this and wanting to do that, but realizing really what fit her the best. And that was how she kind of opened up the can in the room and started to engage with the students about it. Jordan, from your years of working with young people as well as training teachers across the country to work in a strength-based way with the students in their classrooms, how do you see, or what advice do you give to teachers to utilize their own story as a way to open up the can for the young people in their lives?
Yeah, and it's something that we share on every single training. You know, it's like we're wanting to give a peek behind the curtain. We're not asking the teacher to go in there and share their biggest, hairiest, scariest trauma that they've ever been through. We'd actually prefer that they didn't. It's not good for them. It's not good for the students. But being willing to kind of dive into something, you know, like what they went through in junior high, give an overview of it, and kind of just give the students a bit of a peek behind, like, it's just not an educator. I think as students, as young people, we look at adults as having it all together, having all the answers, especially our teachers. You know, like they know all. They are the knowledge keepers, right? So for them to be able to see that humility from the educator and recognize that there's more to that educator than a person and than just a teacher, and to see that this is a person that has had struggles, that's overcame struggles, and has now overcame those struggles to give back to youth, just really allows the youth to feel safe. And that's something that we always want to start with in anything, right? If we start with helping anybody, but especially youth, feel safe, valued, and heard, that's going to allow them to start thinking of the changes they want to make, right? That's what we need to start with. And just by sharing a bit of our story, you know, I know, like, when you started sharing your story, when, like, Chris and I, we've known each other for years. When I started to hear your story, my walls came down instantly, right? Because it's like, here, this isn't just a CEO of an incredibly successful media company. He has a story that's got him here, and there's a passion behind it. You know, there's more to you than just the title. And I think that's something that is so big for the students to see, that it's not just Mr. or Mrs. whoever. There's a story behind it, and there's a reason that they're there, and just helping them connect to each other. And I think, like, that's something that's so valuable. And also what we do is we kind of start to tie that story to knowledge, and tie that knowledge to an experience. You know, so we start off with that really engaging story that helps take the walls down for the students, helps the educator take the walls down, and just levels the playing field for what do we need to do move forward. Then we have reflective questions about that story. What were this person's gifts and abilities? What were some of the walls that they encountered? We then flip the script with some personal reflective questions. What are some of your gifts and abilities? What are some of the walls that you've encountered? How can we take those walls down? So we've kind of primed the pump, and then we have some sort of experiential learning game or activity in the classroom that can take 5 minutes or can take 45 minutes. That's just something way different than they participate in a regular classroom. So tying that knowledge to an experience, something different that they never had, that they'll remember ideally for the rest of their lives. And then wrapping it up with, like, okay, now that you have that knowledge, you have that experience, you've heard this story, you're starting to identify your story, what's your purpose?
Mm-hmm.
What's the next step? How are you going to take everything that you've learned and that you've experienced, and how are you going to apply that in your day-to-day life?
Mm-hmm.
And then also recognizing and building the relationship with those educators, guidance counselors, behavior mentors, whoever's in that classroom to help further that knowledge, right? So it's not just a 20 hours in classroom, hey, you're done, heroes, good luck on your way. They've developed some really solid relationships that they're going to take with them throughout their junior high and high school years that are going to continue to help shape who they are and build confidence in who they are.
So, for Owen, hearing this, and I almost want to get you to repeat that whole process over again. That was a great take. The whole process from the thinking about it, the reviewing it, the reflecting on it, the engaging through it from a storytelling perspective. How do you see that being an integral part of it? It's not just hearing the story or reading the story. There's all these layers built onto it to really grab those lessons, essentials.
Well, two things come to mind. The first thing is it's very good for adults to be telling encouraging stories to kids or to young people. When you are in the trenches, we have a propensity to end our stories. Like, oh, this is the end of my story, that I'm in this space and this is where I'm always going to stay. That like the hare, the stories of the hare, the story, unfortunately for the hare, ends there, and we don't get a sequel about what happens with the hare next. His story is a failure or whatever. But like, I think when we're young, and even I have to be mindful of this with my own self. It's like, I'm not at the end of my story yet. My story continues to go forward. And so I think people need to hear those sort of redemptive arcs in other people's lives, to recognize that no matter where they are, there's a redemption ahead. The possibility for redemption always exists. And I believe that as a fundamental value in my life, that there is always redemption available for every single person. And I think so that's like the first thing I hear from that. The second thing I hear from it would be like, the story is a piece of the puzzle. It's not the whole thing. Like what I do here, it's not the be all and end all. If you think about these short stories like Aesop's Fables or Grimm's Fairy Tales, and you contemplate them in a world before we had books or paper or anybody wrote anything down or anybody knew how to read, these were stories that were told. They were oral tradition, and they're 2 minutes long. So you think you got the whole village together and all the kids in the village together around the campfire for the evening for 1 2-minute story? Not a chance. No. What did that story mean?
Yeah.
What do you think about that? What is this like? What does that bring to mind for you of the last couple of days? Like, there's a great fable about the father with 3 sons, and he's got 3 sons that fight, and the story is kind of like a meta narrative in a way, because he's like as a father, he's trying to figure out, what should I do with my sons that are fighting, and so he takes a bunch of sticks and he gives sticks to each of his sons and say, break that stick, and each of the sons is strong enough to break the stick, and he takes a new set of sticks, it ties it together, and it's a bundle of logs, and he says, now try to break it, and none of them could break it, and he says, you need to stop fighting because a bundle of sticks is not easily broken. So it's like the moral's right there, and you can think about that being a story retold and retold and retold. There's a reason why it's durable, because it's got value to society, but it's not just the story that's valuable, it's the telling of a story that's valuable, it's the contemplation of it that's valuable, and I think that's what I hear in what you're talking about, right?
Yeah. This sharing, I'm thinking about that and thinking about all the different stories that I could tell, or even ask you right now, tell us about the time that you were being too much of a hare, or I was being too much of a hare. Like, that's the conversation. It's the sharing of the story, not just the learning of it.
Yes, yeah. And like for any organization that's trying to fight for relevance in a really noisy world right now, the retelling of story is the most important thing to figure out. You need other people telling your story for you. We need other people talking about impact society behind your backs in a positive way, right? You have to package it in a way that somebody can hold it as a story and then repeat it. But if you can figure out how to do that, then the morals pop up, right? The morals are in our lives. They are experiences that we have where I'm being too much of a hare or whatever. We need to have the stories ready. Basically, we need to try to cue the stories into people's minds so that they can apply them in real time.
Yeah.
How do you teach that? How do you train that? I know that our programs are this beautiful template to be able to turnkey about 4 to 5 months of program material within a classroom and guide students through a program that improves their mental health and resilience, but is all about story. each chapter having a story, culminating in writing your own future life story, challenges and all. But then it ends, or then you got to wait till next year to do the next one. What can we, or what are we already doing? We have hundreds of teachers across the country who are living this out day by day, whether they're doing the Heroes program right now or not. We hear from them about how it's changed their language, changed their culture, shaped the students as well as the educators. What are some, I guess, practical ways that as individuals, parents, or educators, we can take that story sharing idea and use it outside of the confined, here's the pattern of the program, or here's the process, or we're going to do this just once?
This is going to sound, well, I think oftentimes the right answers are super simple. So I'll give you a simple response. If you don't know what story you want somebody telling, and you're not going to get them to tell the right story. So I think the first step in any of this is like, well, what's the story you want repeated by someone else? And after that, it's a matter of identifying like what would be the triggers that you would want to attach that story to. So as I'm as I'm raising my kids and they're having a trouble with somebody at school, let's say, I'm trying to find the story for them that will pop up in their mind at the next time that they experience it, and that kind of thing. So I think it's a little bit of like, if you can understand, you have to understand what it is, what the outcome is that you're trying to achieve, and be quite specific about it, more specific than you think you need to be, probably for most of us. And then I think it's a matter of trying to find ways to directly attach that to the situation in which it's applicable.
So often that power structure, that just default mode, is don't do that.
Yeah, that's a
right?
fact, right? Here's a fact. You're not allowed to do that. Yeah. Doesn't work.
But then when you introduce story,
here's a why, here's a fact, here's a why, here's some context, all these other things that stitch it together. Like, don't do drugs. I'm going to go do drugs. Like, that's what kids react. That's how kids reacted. That's how it was in the 80s, right? And then, but if it's like, don't do drugs because, now you got a second part of the story, and then you got like a bit of a conclusion, like, so that you can add things to what's the outcome you're looking to achieve. Don't do drugs, or maybe the outcome is like don't lose your life or whatever it might be. But I think you can't just leave it at that. You have to kind of move it along in a way that someone can actually receive it.
It really illustrates so well, because we tell these very passionate, superbly written stories that are sometimes hard to read in certain parts, and then we have them doing critical analysis on it, but then flipping it into, okay, now how do I relate to it?
You were saying in school in general? Yeah, like we're studying like process, Charles Dickens or something like that? Yeah. Or you're saying in terms of
within the
heroes.
process of heroes, and how do we take the story from just, let me tell you another story, son,
yeah, totally. Into, which is what I think you're talking about.
Character formation.
Yes,
what we're talking about, I think.
Yeah, arming them with tools, arming them with exercises they can carry forward. Memories, you're creating memories in the classroom with experiential learning and that kind of thing.
And just the conversations that you get to have. Like, I love that you talk when you brought up that 2-minute story. It's like, it's not just about the story, it's so much about the conversation afterwards. It's just like, that story is just used as a can opener, right? It's just like, this is going to set the table for what we're going to move forward into next. I think that's awesome. It took everything in me when you were sharing that story about the old man and his 3 sons, not to say apes together strong. You see the Planet of the Apes, totally. With Caesar when he gets put in that monkey cage and they're all acting up, and he puts the sticks together, apes together.
That's
strong.
Where that's literally a modern version of that fable. Yeah, it's 100%. Yeah, and that's I think about that a lot. Like that, how story has evolved over time, but it's also just stayed so similar, or oftentimes just the same.
Yeah, and I think that's really like where we've strengthened the program and the educators that we've had to work with. It's like we create that community where it's not just one educator trying to find the resources to make a positive impact on the students, which they do. Like they do, and they spend so much time, resources, money developing these amazing things that do have an impact. But that's where we come in. It's like, hey, we've done it. Like we have it. It's all in a nice put together package for you. It's really easy to onboard. It'll take 4 hours of your Friday afternoon, or whenever you have 4 free hours, we can figure it out. And then you will have a template to build confident, successful youth that recognize their strengths and can live from those strengths. And not only just identify those strengths and use them in one area, but look at how they can start using those strengths in multiple areas.
Yeah, cultivate
right?
it.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not just like, okay, we were talking about earlier, like, oh, I'm not good at math, so I'm never going to do it. It's figuring out how to leverage your strengths.
Oh, it's so good.
Yeah, to overcome that barrier of not being good at math.
Yeah.
Right?
So good. Yeah. So good.
And this is story sharing.
Yeah.
It's not just that individual now, it's now a whole cohort of students who are not just taking that one story. Now they're learning story sharing behavior that is really, it's the web that connects the pieces of our lives, the people in our lives, into an integrated whole.
Mm-hmm.
Think about cognitive dissonance. Well, that cognitive dissonance starts really heavy in junior high, especially when you realize adults are hypocrites.
Oh,
right?
yeah, big time.
What happens if those adults don't act like hypocrites? What happens if those teachers share more story and are a bit more vulnerable? How does that transform the learning process as well as the community of the school?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
We're almost out of time, Owen, and I just want to ask one more wrap-up thought from you. When you think about the power of story, think about the work that you do, think about the work that we've done. It's a question that was asked to Joseph Campbell, so I'm going to ask you the same question. What's the story this generation needs in order to overcome what they're facing?
There's a sense, I'd say, right now that we've got a deficit of hope. We don't have enough hope right now. I think we've been in we live in a remarkable period of time. And there are things that are getting vastly better, vastly more accessible, easier to access, and I even just think about like the ability to like have a studio like this and have an organization like yours put up media that can literally reach the world. Like that's new stuff. That wasn't available 20 years ago, and at least not as accessible. So we have a bunch of things in the world that are going really well, and then but at the same time we have a bunch of things that are going quite poorly and seem to be on a trajectory of getting worse. We think about like homelessness, we think about addiction, mental health continues to be sort of a can of worms that continues to unpack. So we are in this place of increasing dissonance. I would say that we share generally as a society right now this kind of like feeling of really good and really bad at the same time and in different areas. Until we align on a brighter future, we won't be able to work together to write the sort of like the come up of the story, the next the rising action of the story. And I'm thinking about this as societally, but I think it applies individually just the same. The ingredient there is hope. Yeah. What you need is a hope for a future that you are pulling towards. That's the thing that keeps the hero going on their journey as they're moving through it. Is there's still a hope out there for something better. That's the thing that brings the POW back from prison back home. Is there's a hope to reach their family again. It's the thing that arrests suicide in many cases, not in every case, but many cases, is that there is a glimpse of hope. I think that's a thing we need to focus on. I don't think it needs to be platitudes. It certainly shouldn't be empty, but there has to be a thing that people feel is worth fighting towards. And then the second half, or the other side of that coin, is that they have a meaning. We all need to come to the realization that every single one of us has a meaningful part to play in achieving that hope, regardless of who you are, what your job is, how old you are, what your background is, where you came from. There is a hope that you can contribute towards meaningfully.
Jordan, you want to reflect on that before we?
Yeah, I think like that's exactly it, right? Like we're just looking at what we can do to reflect on our stories, what we can share from our stories, and how we can provide that level of hope. You know, we talked earlier, Owen, and that was a big part of it, is just, you know, finding that bit of hope again, and finding that bit of like things are going to be okay, and it's okay to not be okay. It's okay to have hope in times that might seem hopeless, and that's really what it's hopefully that we're creating in these kids, is recognizing that, like, hey, we're not trying to take away your struggles or say that
Diminish
you're never,
them.
yeah, or say that you're never going to run in them. It's like, hey, life is hard. You're going to go through those times when things feel hopeless and you feel like you're going to break in half, but you're not, right? You can get through it. You can persevere. You can continue pushing, and life will get better. And I think that's it. If we can just supply that little glimmer of hope, and I've seen that little glimmer of hope do miraculous things, right? When someone can just get that thought of maybe things can be better. Maybe my life can turn around. Maybe I don't have to feel like this forever. They can start grabbing onto that and start putting in the little actions that then turn into something much bigger.
Yes. Yeah. And it doesn't stay as a glimmer for very long either, does it?
No.
Because the moment you take a step towards it, that light gets brighter.
Totally.
Yeah.
And we're not talking about unfathomable goals. Jordan, you
No.
speak so well about this. You usually start a class, and a lot of kids want to be Grammy Award winning artists or professional sports athletes, and that's great. And that is a hope. It's a goal. It's a big idea that can cause cognitive dissonance at some point when they realize that they can't make that cut. That said, our process is to help them understand, okay, what is it about that? What are the strengths that are feeding this desire, so that you not only have a hope, but you now are transformed through these stories that we tell into someone who can purvey hope and continue to be hopeful and give others hope at the same time. This conversation could probably go on for another 2 hours, but I really appreciate diving into this, and the significance of story is really that connective tissue. When we see no hope, when we see low resilience, we see situations seen as the be all and end all. It's never going to get better. This is all. This is it. This is all I'm worth. But when we start to open up and share story, that connective tissue comes in place, and all of a sudden, there's more to this than this exact moment, this exact label or fear or circumstance.
Yeah.
This has been a great reminder on why I do what I do, and the power of my story, the power of all of our stories, and the importance, if you're listening, to be able to continue sharing those stories with individuals, within your class, within your family, that connect that tissue, that relationship, and that hope.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming on. Appreciate it.
So good. Yeah. Glad to be here.
Thank you.